This morning, October 17th, Russia woke up to a shock that the government is still struggling to explain. At approximately 6:40 a.m. local time, a massive explosion struck one of the country's largest oil refineries on the outskirts of Moscow, the Ryazan complex, responsible for nearly 10% of Russia's domestic fuel production. Within minutes, flames engulfed several key processing units, and black smoke rose over the capital's southern horizon, visible for dozens of kilometers. Officially, authorities described the event as a localized fire. Unofficially, it was nothing short of a catastrophe. Multiple intelligence and energy sources confirmed that the facility was hit in what appears to be a coordinated drone strike, the most serious attack on Russia's energy infrastructure since the beginning of the conflict. By mid-morning, the Ministry of Energy released a brief statement promising a rapid stabilization of fuel supplies. But insiders say the reality is grim. The refinery has been completely shut down. Initial assessments suggest extensive damage to the catalytic cracking units, the heart of the plant's production capacity. Without them, fuel output for central Russia will collapse within days. A senior official in the energy sector admitted privately, "We've never faced a hit like this." There's no quick fix. The government has already activated emergency reserves, rerouting fuel from distant regions, but logistical bottlenecks and infrastructure limitations mean shortages are inevitable. For the residents of Moscow, the impact was immediate and visible. Long queues began forming at gas stations by 9 a.m. Several stations raised prices overnight. Others simply stopped selling fuel for technical reasons. On social media, users posted videos showing traffic jams near filling stations, while officials urged citizens not to panic. Yet panic is precisely what began to spread. "I've never seen anything like this," said one driver interviewed anonymously. "It feels like something bigger is happening, something they're not telling us." Inside government circles, confusion quickly turned to alarm. According to our sources, an emergency meeting was convened at the Kremlin before noon. The Defense Ministry pushed to classify the incident as foreign aggression, while the Interior Ministry argued for industrial sabotage. The conflicting narratives reveal the scale of uncertainty. Satellite data reviewed by Western experts reportedly show multiple drone trajectories approaching from the northwest, bypassing key radar systems. If confirmed, it means Moscow's air defenses, considered the most sophisticated in the country, failed to detect or intercept the attack. But the technical details are only part of the story. The deeper crisis is psychological. For years, Russian officials have reassured the public that the capital remains invulnerable, protected by layers of defense, isolated from the chaos at the front. Today, that illusion has been shattered. The sight of fire and smoke near the heart of Moscow, the sudden fuel shortages, and the silence of officials combine into a single, unmistakable message. The center is no longer untouchable. In expert circles, the phrase strategic paralysis is now being used, a term reserved for moments when a state's symbols of control begin to fail in real time. Moscow's confidence, its rhythm, its normality, all suddenly fragile. The refinery, once a background feature of the capital's industrial landscape, has become a burning reminder of vulnerability. Subscribe to follow what happens next, because, according to insiders, today's explosion may not be an isolated incident, but the opening act of a campaign designed to bring the crisis from the front lines straight into the heart of Russia itself. By midday, the consequences of the refinery attack had begun to ripple through every layer of Russian life. Fuel supplies across Moscow and the surrounding regions were collapsing. Traffic ground to a halt as gas stations closed one after another, some running out of fuel entirely by noon. Public transport was ordered to conserve resources, and long-distance deliveries were suspended until logistical stability is restored. The official tone of calm could not conceal the panic on the streets. Videos flooded telegrams showing desperate drivers arguing with attendants, some offering cash bribes just to fill a few extra liters. A sense of disbelief spread across the capital. Not just that a major refinery could be destroyed, but that the government seemed powerless to respond. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was described by sources as controlled chaos. A crisis task force was formed, bringing together senior officials from the Defense Ministry, the FSB, and the Energy Ministry. Their first order of business: assess the damage. Preliminary reports confirmed that at least 3 processing units were completely destroyed. The fire, though localized by late morning, had crippled the refinery's structural integrity. Engineers warned that repairs could take months. "You can replace pipes," one energy analyst noted, "but you can't replace the sense of safety that's just been lost." Meanwhile, Moscow's financial markets reacted with violent speed. The ruble dropped sharply against the dollar, prompting the central bank to announce emergency interventions. Oil and gas stocks plunged despite trading restrictions, and traders described the morning as a free fall in slow motion. The government ordered state media to emphasize economic resilience, but even the anchors' voices trembled. By early afternoon, the phrase temporary fuel adjustment appeared in official press releases, a euphemism that everyone understood to mean shortages. On the ground, those shortages were already visible. Emergency vehicles patrolled the streets not to fight fires, but to maintain order at fuel stations. Supermarkets reported disruptions in deliveries, and taxi services began tripling fares as drivers rationed what little fuel remained. Across the country, regional governors received directives from Moscow to prepare for redistribution of fuel reserves. But there was little to redistribute. Russia's internal logistics rely heavily on refineries like Ryazan, central nodes that feed pipelines, transport fleets, and aviation supply chains. The destruction of one such node sends shockwaves across the entire economy. But beyond the technical and economic damage, a deeper fear began to settle in. The realization that Moscow's defenses had failed. According to multiple sources in the defense sector, the drones that struck the refinery flew low, exploiting radar blind spots, and likely originated from within Russia's own territory. That possibility, that the attack may have come from inside, sent shock through security circles. For years, the Kremlin had portrayed internal stability as unshakable. Now, with smoke still rising over Moscow, even loyal officials whispered questions once considered unthinkable. Who else could strike next? And how close to the Kremlin could it happen? Internationally, reactions were immediate. European energy markets saw a sharp spike in oil prices, while U.S. intelligence agencies reportedly began monitoring Russian military communications for signs of retaliation. In Kiev, officials issued no statements, though the timing of the attack, simultaneous with disruptions in several Russian border regions, led many observers to suspect a coordinated operation. Western analysts, however, focused on a different point: the symbolism. This wasn't just an explosion, one senior European diplomat noted. It was a message that Russia's capital, its heart, is now reachable. Meanwhile, Russian social media entered a new phase of fragmentation. Pro-Kremlin channels accused foreign terrorists, while nationalist bloggers demanded resignations within the defense ministry. Rumors spread of additional targets: power plants, rail hubs, communications centers. Authorities dismissed these as speculative misinformation, but the denials only fueled more speculation. In a city accustomed to control, information itself was slipping out of reach. By early afternoon, Moscow began to feel smaller, slower, uncertain. The air still smelled faintly of burning fuel, and the black plume over the southern horizon refused to fade. Commuters stared silently through train windows, watching the smoke as if it were a foreign sight. For the first time in years, the capital looked less like the center of power and more like a city under siege, not from an external army, but from the fragility of its own system. And yet, the most troubling question remains unanswered. If this attack was possible once, what prevents it from happening again, and closer to the very heart of Moscow? By early afternoon, Moscow was no longer functioning as a normal city. The familiar rhythm, the traffic, the endless hum of engines, the illusion of order, had collapsed. The attack on the Ryazan refinery, once dismissed as a minor fire, had turned into a full-scale national emergency. According to our sources, the government quietly activated a Level 3 fuel contingency plan, a classification used only in wartime. All non-essential fuel distribution was frozen. Civilian aviation began grounding domestic flights. Even military logistics in Western Russia were forced to adjust flight schedules due to refueling delays. The Kremlin didn't announce it publicly, but the entire country had just entered an economic lockdown. Inside Moscow, signs of the breakdown were everywhere. Gas stations were guarded by police, who stood beside empty pumps and handed out rationing slips. Buses stopped running in several districts, replaced by hastily organized military trucks transporting essential workers. Taxi fares skyrocketed beyond affordability. At the same time, power outages began flickering across the outskirts of the city, not from attacks, but from overloaded backup systems trying to stabilize the grid after the refinery shutdown. "We're watching the capital grind to a halt in real time," said one energy specialist. "This is the scenario we always feared but never prepared for." In the financial sector, the situation was equally dire. The ruble continued to plunge despite massive central bank interventions. Several domestic banks limited withdrawals and halted currency exchanges. Behind closed doors, the Ministry of Finance held back-to-back meetings to discuss emergency liquidity measures. But the issue was no longer financial. It was psychological. The Russian public, conditioned for years to believe in the state's invincibility, suddenly realized how fragile the system really was. The refinery wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was a symbol of continuity, of permanence. Its destruction made millions question whether Moscow could still protect itself, or anything at all. Meanwhile, panic spread quietly through government institutions. Sources describe scenes of frantic phone calls between ministries, with officials contradicting each other on live television. The Ministry of Energy insisted that fuel reserves will cover civilian needs, while the Transport Ministry admitted that distribution remains under strain. A leaked directive instructed regional governors to avoid statements that could cause public alarm. But the alarm was already visible. In the long lines at ATMs, the empty store shelves, the whispers on public transport. The security dimension of the crisis deepened by the hour. According to preliminary investigations, at least 6 drones were involved in the strike. 4 destroyed by air defenses too late, 2 hitting their targets. For a system that prided itself on impenetrable defenses, the breach was devastating. This wasn't just an attack, said one military analyst in Moscow. It was a demonstration that even the heart of the capital can be reached, and nothing can stop it. The psychological effect of that realization is immeasurable. Soldiers guarding checkpoints near the city were seen doubling patrols, scanning the skies nervously as rumors circulated about more incoming drones. By mid-afternoon, President Putin had still not appeared in public. No press conference, no statement. Only a brief message from the Kremlin's spokesperson. All measures are being taken to restore stability. The absence of visible leadership became the story itself. On state television, presenters struggled to maintain composure. Their words, resilience, discipline, calm, sounded mechanical, detached, almost surreal against the images of fire still smoldering near Moscow's southern perimeter. For years, the Kremlin built its power on control, of information, of narrative, of fear. Today, it had lost control of all three. Internationally, the reaction was swift but cautious. Oil markets surged, with Brent crude prices spiking to their highest levels in over a year. Western analysts described the event as the first true shock to the Russian energy core. Diplomats in Europe reported unusual traffic between Moscow and Beijing, suggesting urgent consultations. The attack's precision, and the timing, hinted at capabilities far beyond isolated sabotage. Someone wanted Moscow to feel what war actually is, one European intelligence officer said. And it worked. But inside Russia, there was no space left for speculation, only the immediate reality of scarcity. Public transportation systems slowed, industries paused operations, and households began hoarding what they could. Moscow, a city built on excess and movement, suddenly found itself immobile. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the low hum of generators, and the quiet unease of a population realizing that the war they had watched from a distance had finally arrived at their doorstep. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, one phrase began circulating among bureaucrats and businessmen alike: the Ryazan effect. It didn't just describe the destruction of a refinery. It described a rupture in confidence, a breaking point in the illusion of control. The question now wasn't whether Russia could recover its fuel supply, it was whether it could recover its composure, or if this day marked the moment Moscow's sense of safety burned out for good. Subscribe to stay ahead, because according to insiders, what's unfolding now isn't just a crisis of fuel. It's the unraveling of the very system that once promised Russians they'd never have to live through a day like this. By late afternoon, Moscow was in a state the Kremlin had not witnessed since the early 1990s, a city still functioning, but only by inertia. The smoke above the destroyed refinery was finally thinning, yet its shadow seemed to stretch over the entire capital. Gasoline shortages had turned from rumor to routine. Every intersection felt slower, quieter, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Inside government buildings, the atmosphere was thick with a mix of disbelief and dread. Officials no longer spoke of restoration, they spoke of containment. Their task was no longer to fix the damage, but to prevent panic from becoming visible. According to several sources close to the Ministry of Energy, the attack crippled more than just production capacity. The Ryazan complex was a hub for Russia's internal fuel logistics, a node connecting multiple regional supply chains through pipelines, rail networks, and storage facilities. When it went offline, entire sectors began collapsing in sequence. Refinery shutdowns triggered transportation halts. Transportation halts disrupted agriculture, emergency services, and even food deliveries. In the early hours, Moscow still had fuel for roughly 3 days of standard operation. By sunset, that estimate had dropped to less than 48 hours. The government's public response remained minimal. State television repeated phrases about temporary disruptions, while the Ministry of Defense promised that countermeasures are being taken. But behind closed doors, the crisis team inside the Kremlin was overwhelmed. Documents reviewed by our sources reveal growing disagreement between the ministries. The Energy Ministry urged immediate fuel rationing across the country. The Finance Ministry opposed it, fearing economic collapse. The Interior Ministry pushed for curfews in major cities to conserve supplies. None of these measures were publicly announced, yet local authorities began implementing them quietly. Gas stations closing at dusk, night deliveries halted, and public lighting dimmed to reduce fuel consumption. In the capital's suburbs, the atmosphere turned tense. Residents reported patrols by National Guard units near fuel depots and railway terminals. Rumors spread that officials were preparing to declare a technical emergency. Lines at grocery stores lengthened as people began stockpiling not just fuel, but food and cash. The few functioning ATMs were besieged by customers withdrawing whatever they could, despite government reassurances that the banking system remained stable. The longer the reassurances continued, the less anyone believed them. For Moscow's elite, the shock was existential. The idea that the capital, the political heart of Russia, could be struck so precisely shattered a decade of psychological certainty. Sources inside the business community describe panic spreading through corporate circles. "It's not just about energy," said one executive. "It's about exposure. If drones can reach the refinery, they can reach anything. Offices, residences, power stations. Suddenly, nothing feels untouchable." Private security firms reported an immediate surge in requests from wealthy clients seeking evacuation plans or alternate fuel sources. Helicopters at private airfields were refueled, for now, but even aviation fuel was being rationed. Internationally, the attack was being analyzed as more than a tactical success. Western intelligence services reportedly intercepted frantic communications between Russian agencies in the hours after the explosion. Analysts noted that no single department appeared to be in charge. The chain of command, long considered the Kremlin's strength, was breaking down under pressure. "This is the most serious test of the Russian state's internal discipline since the start of the war," said one senior European defense official. The myth of vertical control is unraveling in real time. Yet the Kremlin's information apparatus continued to fight on a different front, the battle for perception. By evening, dozens of pro-government commentators appeared on television, accusing foreign intelligence services of orchestrating terror attacks deep inside Russia. They spoke of external enemies, cowardly sabotage, and global conspiracies. But the words no longer carried conviction. On social media, even loyal audiences reacted with skepticism. The public had seen the fire with their own eyes. They knew the flames weren't a rumor or a Western fabrication. They were real, visible from their apartment windows. Meanwhile, fuel shortages began hitting essential services. Ambulances in several regions were instructed to respond only to life-threatening emergencies. Food distributors slowed deliveries due to a lack of diesel. In one Moscow district, bakery owners admitted they had only enough flour and power for 2 more days of production. What was once a stable metropolis was turning into a chain of disconnected zones, each trying to preserve whatever resources it still had. Inside the Kremlin, a late afternoon briefing captured the scale of disarray. Ministers sat around the table in near silence as an intelligence officer presented intercepted drone telemetry, proof that the attack had likely been launched from within Russian territory. "This changes everything," one senior official murmured, according to a source present. The phrase hung in the room like smoke. It wasn't just about who had attacked, but what it revealed. A breach not only in the skies, but in the illusion of security that had held the state together for years. And yet, even as the government scrambled to contain the crisis, something subtler was happening, a psychological shift. For decades, Moscow had lived with the certainty that whatever chaos existed elsewhere, it could never reach the capital. Today, that certainty was gone. The refinery's ruins were no longer just an industrial disaster. They were a symbol of exposure. The city still stood, but its sense of invulnerability had collapsed. As night approached, the official line remained unchanged. "The situation is under control." But the silence behind that sentence told another story. One of a leadership caught between disbelief and fear, of a population realizing that stability can vanish overnight, and of a capital that suddenly felt smaller, darker and closer to the edge than ever before. What began as an explosion had become something larger, a moment when Moscow stopped being the untouchable center of power and started becoming just another vulnerable city, waiting for the next alarm. By evening, Moscow was a city of quiet chaos, orderly on the surface but trembling beneath. The fires at the Ryazan refinery had finally been extinguished, yet the sense of crisis only deepened. The smoke that had hovered above the capital all day had thinned, but in its place came something less visible and far more dangerous: uncertainty. For the first time in a generation, Russia's most guarded city looked exposed. And as the sun fell behind the skyline, the illusion of control, so carefully maintained for years, began to disintegrate. According to multiple government sources, the Kremlin held its third emergency session in less than 12 hours. The discussions, described by one insider as open panic in formal language, revolved around a single question: what to tell the country. The Ministry of Energy insisted the situation was localized. The Defense Ministry demanded to label the attack as foreign terrorism. The Federal Security Service warned against both, arguing that any official admission would confirm that Moscow's defenses had failed. "They're not managing a crisis anymore," said a source close to the administration. "They're managing disbelief." Outside the government walls, disbelief had already turned into anxiety. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks, with drivers sleeping in their cars. The few stations still operational limited sales to 5 liters per vehicle. Grocery stores began to ration deliveries. Fresh produce vanished first, followed by basic staples like flour and oil. Black market fuel prices tripled overnight, and new telegram channels appeared offering private fuel transfers at 10 times the official rate. Rumors spread that Moscow's metro might shut down to conserve energy, forcing city officials to make public denials. Even so, commuters whispered that it was only a matter of time. For the elite, the panic took a different shape. Several private jets departed from Vnukovo and Sheremetyevo in the early evening, their flight paths tracing westward. Business owners began quietly relocating families abroad under the pretext of temporary holidays. The oligarchic networks that once formed the regime's financial backbone were suddenly paralyzed. "This attack did what sanctions couldn't," said one Western diplomat monitoring the situation. "It introduced fear into the bloodstream of Moscow's ruling class." Meanwhile, the national media struggled to maintain composure. Anchors spoke slowly, avoiding any words that hinted at crisis. The official evening broadcasts showed pre-recorded footage of refinery workers restoring operations, though experts immediately identified the images as archival. On social media, users mocked the staged optimism, sharing real-time photos of darkened city streets and closed petrol stations. For years, propaganda had been the Kremlin's strongest weapon. Tonight, it sounded like background noise in a city that no longer believed. The government attempted to impose calm through bureaucracy. By 1900 hours, a presidential decree declared temporary energy stabilization measures, introducing curfews on fuel sales and restricting the use of private vehicles. The decree was not broadcast on national television but leaked almost immediately through unofficial channels, causing another wave of panic. For many, the document was confirmation that the situation was far worse than admitted. Analysts called it the first step toward martial control of the economy, an acknowledgement that the crisis had crossed from logistics to governance. But the most striking change was psychological. Moscow's residents, long accustomed to distance from the country's wars and crises, felt the border between safety and exposure disappear in a single day. The sound of drones, once something heard only in news clips from distant fronts, now belonged to their own sky. The war that had always seemed somewhere else had finally found its way to their streets, their gas stations, their wallets. And that realization, not the explosion, not the smoke, was what truly shattered the illusion. According to sources within the Defense Ministry, intercepted communications confirmed the attack's precision was no coincidence. The drones exploited internal flight corridors, suggesting insider knowledge of Russia's air defense grid. That revelation, quietly circulating among officials, deepened the sense of paranoia at the top. "They don't know who to blame," one insider said. "And when you can't identify the enemy, everyone becomes the enemy." By nightfall, the ripple effects reached the international stage. Oil prices surged beyond $110 per barrel, global markets tensed, and Western governments convened emergency consultations. Yet, in Moscow, the response remained muted, not out of strength, but exhaustion. A senior Kremlin aide, speaking under condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere as the end of certainty. The attack had not just disrupted fuel production, It had punctured the myth of Moscow's invulnerability. The very narrative that defined Russian power, control, endurance, order, was slipping away in real time. And still, the official message remained unchanged. Everything is under control. The words appeared on every channel, every platform, every government statement. But they no longer sounded like reassurance. They sounded like an echo, a phrase repeated so often it had lost all meaning. The only thing truly under control now was silence. In the quiet streets of the capital, people gathered on balconies and rooftops, staring south where the faint glow of the refinery's wreckage still flickered against the night sky. There were no sirens, no speeches, no explanations, just the hum of generators and the distant buzz of drones somewhere above the horizon. Experts now agree that this day marks a threshold, not only in the war, but in Russia's perception of itself. The explosion didn't merely shut down a refinery, it shut down the illusion that Moscow was immune, that chaos could be contained to the periphery. The war had come home, and with it, a new reality, a capital that no longer knows what it can defend. Subscribe to stay ahead of what follows, because as insiders warn, the fire may be out, but the crisis it revealed is only beginning. What burned today was not just fuel. It was certainty,